Come on, Choji, feel it. Yes, Choji. Yep.
What's up, Nerfers? Today, I'm taking a look at the new, much smaller, close quarters model of the highly popular Worker Harrier blaster. The Harrier that came before it, since release, has been my top recommendation to new players looking to get a long-range 300 FPS Nerf sniper. Its price-to-performance ratio and durability are currently unmatched. But what if you don't need the power of a 300 feet per second sniper? Could you get away with making it shorter? That's where the Worker Seagull comes in. It's absolutely tiny. From the front of the orange scar barrel to the end of the buttstock is only 65 centimeters in length. I'll put that up in hands or feet or whatever you American viewers use. And on top of that, it's incredibly light as well, weighing in at just over 1 kilogram. The small length and the light weight make this a perfect blaster for your kids to use, and it would also be the perfect size for dominating in close quarters battles, just like you saw at the start of the video. First of all, I want to extend a thanks to both Frontline Foam in the USA and Worker themselves over in China for sending me the Seagull to review. Check out the links down below if you want to pick one of these up for yourself. It's available in a few different colors: purple, pink, green, white, or what I have here, khaki. I'm not sure I would really call this khaki though. It's definitely more of a warm-toned white. From my understanding of what Worker were trying to say, they've moved to a slightly different material with the Seagull, resulting in a more matte finish and more pastel-y color options than the Harrier. Being a direct descendant of the Harrier though, the Seagull is also built like an absolute tank. The externals are all nice thick injection molded plastic, and you don't have to treat it gently like you would a 3D printed blaster. To make it lighter and shorter compared to the Harrier, if it isn't a compromise in durability, what have Worker actually changed with the Seagull? Well, essentially, they've shortened the length of the plunger tube inside, which in turn allowed them to shorten the prime length and the entire blaster in general. So that means the trade-off with the Seagull is obviously going to be the lower maximum power output compared to the Harrier. But that might be a good trade-off to make, especially if you play in close quarters environments like I'm using it at here. Just how much performance it has lost compared to the Harrier, well, that's something I'm going to have to answer later on in the video. But I think you may be very surprised by the results. Beginning with an overview at the front of the Seagull, Worker have included one of their blaze orange rifling attachments. These have been around for quite a few years at this point, but if you haven't seen one of these before, the Worker rifling just friction fits onto the end of the barrel. It holds nice and tight enough on there that even at higher spring loads, it isn't going to come off during a game. With the rifling removed though, the aluminium barrel itself is threaded at the breech end, so I can actually unscrew it and easily show you. The specs of this default barrel are 12.9mm on the inside, 16mm on the outside, and it has a total length of 210mm, making it 100mm shorter than the Harrier's stock barrel, which Worker actually included in the box with the Seagull as well as a longer barrel option. Being that the entire goal of the Seagull is to be shorter, I'll test the performance of both barrels later on, just to see whether the longer one is worth using at all. On the left and right sides of the Seagull, it has a short metal Picatinny rail segment for adding attachments like flashlights or cameras. These are shorter in length than the side rails on the Harrier, but they still have plenty enough real estate for all of your attachments. On the underside of the blaster, it has a low profile vertical grip, which is angled longer at the front and shorter at the back. Something I noticed very quickly is that my pinky finger doesn't quite fit on here with the rest of my hand, but I'm sure my UK viewers will absolutely love this feature. Personally, I'm quite used to low profile vertical grips from my time with CQB gel ball blasters, but if you'd prefer a longer grip that your whole hand fits onto, It just has Picatinny rail underneath, so you can just swap it out. Inside of the front end, there's a return spring to keep the breech closed when you angle the blaster upwards. I found that this can bind up and get in the way a bit during barrel swaps. I suspect they've kept the spring the same length as the Harrier one despite shortening everything else, hence why it can be a little more finicky to push your barrel through. When you're swapping out that barrel, just persevere and it will make it through. With the return spring, you can also just let go of the vertical grip to chamber a dart, which you've got to admit looks pretty cool. Up top, the Seagull comes with front and rear iron sights with replica fiber optics inside of them. The rear sight can actually adjust slightly side to side. Pretty cool for an included sight. One issue I did notice is that with such a short stock on here and short length overall, it can be really hard to get a clean sight picture through them unless you move the rear one further forwards, which looks kinda dumb. There is a nice full-length Picatinny rail though, so I'd personally just add an optic of your own and keep the irons as is just for looks. My suggestion would be a cheap 1x red dot sight. The Seagull comes with a brand new curved black magazine. Don't worry, it's standard Worker Talon geometry, and I do think it suits the blaster quite well. But because it's opaque, you can't see how many darts you have left, so my pick would still be the old standard Worker Talon. With the breech closed, mags cannot gravity drop, so you do have to give them a little bit of a pull to remove. With the breech open though, they can drop freely when you hit the mag release. But with a return spring on the prime, it's not really feasible. If you do want to do fancy tactical reloads, you could remove the return spring, but personally, I would just stick with pulling the mags out. Above the trigger, you'll find the safety switch. Push it in from the left side to engage the safety, or push it back through from the right to release. If you slam the blaster down on its side, you can actually get the safety switch to engage on its own. But just placing it down normally, it didn't put enough force on it to do so. Just like the Harrier, the Seagull has a hair trigger with a couple of millimeters of travel before you reach a nice solid wall. Having a very nice trigger pull is one of the features Worker deliberately designed for on these two blasters, and they achieved that with the shape of the catch and the plunger rod. Taking a look at the grip, Worker have done away with the questionable cutlass style guard that it had on the Harrier, and they've replaced it with a much nicer looking and actually functional sling mount at the bottom. At the back end, the Seagull has a non-adjustable low profile stock. With the shape of this, it could also kind of double as a handle to carry the blaster around with. And if you don't have a sling, you could probably even just hook it onto your chest rig or into a mag pouch to carry it on you, or even just hang it off of things around the field. It attaches to the buffer tube with a single screw on the left side of the blaster, so you could very easily undo that and remove it to put a stock of your own onto the buffer tube itself. But you will then need to move the included Allen key from its lower storage spot and put it on the back of the buffer tube like on the Harrier. Speaking of that Allen key, the Seagull retains the quick takedown functionality of the Harrier. Simply undo your choice of the front two screws on the top rail or the back two. I've gone with the back two screws and I've deliberately mounted my rear iron sight just forward enough that I can reach the rear screw without it getting in the way. With the top two rail screws removed, now undo the two side screws. With those out, the blaster separates into two halves, giving you direct access to the plunger tube. The Seagull uses the exact same plunger rod as the Harrier, so aftermarket upgrade parts like the Sabre plunger rod and the Sabre metal catch will all fit into the Seagull, no worries. I do believe the mag release is a little different, but all the other parts should fit fine. Additionally, just like on the Harrier, all of the screws on the Seagull thread into brass inserts rather than the plastic itself. A big improvement over Worker's earlier blasters like the Prophecy, where they screwed directly into plastic and over time they would end up stripping. With the plunger rod out, you can very easily and very quickly swap the spring. Worker include two different length springs with the blaster. The shorter one is a 1.4 by 250mm long, and the more powerful one is the same but just 280mm long. Now, I've never seen any other blasters do this, but Worker have added heat shrink to the rear ends of the springs to help dampen the sound of them when you fire, making the blaster quieter. When I do my chrono testing in a moment, you'll even get to hear the difference, because I actually have one other spring that doesn't come with the blaster. One without any heat shrink on its ends, and to be honest, probably a spring that isn't meant for this blaster. The Worker 1.6 by 300mm spring is the strongest spring that they sell for the much larger, more powerful Harrier, but I am very curious to see how the Seagull performs with it installed. So now, it's time for the chrono test. For all of my testing, I'm using Worker bamboo darts, which were kindly provided by Foamwork Adelaide. Check them out at the links down below. To begin with, here's the shorter of the included springs, along with the shortest barrel. This should give what I assume will be the lowest power option of the Seagull.
168, 169, 169 again, 171, 164, 167, absolutely effortless to prime, 183, 167, 169, 170, 166, 168, 170, 167, 166. That must be all 15.
The short barrel combined with the short spring shot a high of 183, low of 164, average of 168, and it had a standard deviation of 4.3. Next up, I'll unscrew the short barrel, put on the long barrel, and see how that changes things with the same spring.
171. 171 again. 167. 162. 163. 160. 156. 154. 170. 173. 167. 170. 162. 162 again. 170. That's all 15.
With the long barrel and short spring, it shot a high of 173, low of 154, average of 165, with a standard deviation of 5.8. It actually lost an average of 3 feet per second with the longer barrel, so I suspect that the short spring pairs best with the short barrel. Next up, I'll put the short barrel back on and we're going to swap in the longer of the two springs.
184, 180, 183, 184, 186, 181, 189, 188, 192, 190, 187, 189, 189 again, 178, 174. That's all 15.
The short barrel and long spring combo shot a high of 192, low of 174, average of 184, with a standard deviation of 5, a gain of 16 feet per second on average over the shorter spring. I wonder though whether the longer spring works better with the longer barrel. So let's swap it in and see how it does.
194, 194 again, 185, 182, 181, 182, 180. 180 again. 179. 180. 183. 181. 180. 193. 183. That's all 15.
The long barrel and the long spring combo shot a high of 194, low of 179, average of 183, with a standard deviation of 5.3. Surprisingly, it actually lost 1 feet per second on average compared to the short barrel. So basically no difference at all. My recommendation then would be sticking with the short barrel, since this blaster is designed for close quarters after all. But what about the maximum potential of the Seagull? It's time to swap in the 1.6 by 300mm Harrier spring, and first I'll test the short barrel.
$226. $240. $221. $243. $233. $240. $242. $245. $245 again. $243. $227. $260. $259. $270. $261. And that's all 15 of those.
With the 1.6 by 300 Harrier spring and the short barrel, it shot a high of 270, low of 227, average of 243, with a standard deviation of 14. It's definitely lost some consistency compared to the lower power springs, but what can you honestly expect when you're pushing this CQB blaster to its limits? I'm very interested to see what the long barrel does though, so let's find out.
227. 231. 237. 231. 223. 256. 263. 265. 252. 252 again. 261. 269. 266. 290. That's got to be a record. 263. And that's all 15 of those.
With the 1.6 by 300 Harrier spring and the long barrel, it shot a high of 290, low of 223, average of 252, and it had a standard deviation of 18.9. The long barrel gained 9 feet per second over the short barrel, but at the same time it was even less consistent. What the long barrel does allow me to do though is, since it's also the stock barrel of the Harrier, I can now compare what the Seagull does versus the Harrier with the same barrel and spring. And with all 3 of the springs I tested in the long barrels, the Seagull only shot around 17 feet per second lower than a Harrier. Given how much they've shortened the Harrier by to make the Seagull, I was expecting it to be far lower than that. I'm actually quite impressed. As for the Seagull's long barrel versus its short barrel, I don't think the long barrel gives enough of a benefit with any of the springs to be worth using when the Seagull is designed specifically to be a short CQB blaster. I think if you're considering using the long barrel in the Seagull, you'd be better off just buying a Harrier instead for the 17 FPS improvement its larger plunger volume provides. Now for my final test, I wanted to see how the Seagull with that 1.6 by 300 spring combined with the short 210mm barrel and Worker Scar, I wanted to see how they shoot for accuracy.
Alright, I figured out, need to aim around here on the tree for the shots to drop down to around the center of the target. First up, I'll be testing 1 gram worker bamboos and then the brand new 15% heavier green tip darts to see how they do in Worker's injection molded rifling. I'm at a distance of 30 meters or 98 feet, firing at a target 1 meter across. Hit. 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 Barely though. Just missed to the right. Hit. 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 Hit the white sign above. That must have been a fast start. Again. Hit. 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 That's all 15 of those. On to the heavy ones. Aiming in the same spot. I expect they'll probably go a little lower on the target, but if you adjust for that and just aim a bit higher, they'll actually go further. Hit. 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 These don't seem to be going that much lower. Hit. 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 Must be getting near the end. Hit. Oh, got one of those on the white too. Must have been going faster than the others. And that's all 15 of the heavies. I know a lot of you Americans absolutely love the Worker rifling. I honestly don't think it's that great. If you take a look at my last 2 videos, so when I tested the Saber Blaster and the bearing scarf from Foamwork Adelaide on the slab, I think they were grouping a lot better than this thing was.
With 1 gram Worker bamboos, aside from one shot that landed lower on the target than the others, the Seagull shot pretty much a 60 centimeter spread. Adding the green tip heavies to the picture, those deviated less left to right, but they were slightly more spread out vertically. This is a better shape spread for hitting a human target, but it's not as dramatic of an improvement as my last few videos with the green tip heavies. Now, compared to its CQB competitor, the XYL Unicorn Blaster, they both shot fairly similar spreads. However, the XYL Unicorn was using a more modern foamwork Adelaide bearing scar, and it also topped out at 188 feet per second compared to the 243 of the Seagull. So I don't really think the XYL Unicorn is in the same league as the Seagull. A better comparison would be the Harrier versus the Seagull. In my Harrier video, I was using the same exact dated worker rifling that it comes with, and though it was shooting 300 feet per second with a longer barrel, it also shot a fairly similar 60cm spread to that of the Seagull. I think both the Harrier and the Seagull could benefit from better, more modern options of rifling, like the bearing scar pictured on the box art. Why was that not included? But with all of that information gathered, what are my final thoughts on the Seagull? Well, where the Harrier is a longer, more powerful, and more marksman-oriented springer, the Seagull does exceptionally well in close quarters. Its smaller size, lighter weight, and lower profile lend it to filling a role that the Harrier isn't really designed for. The Seagull can be tuned anywhere between 243 and 168 feet per second, depending on which spring you use, which darts you use, and whether you customize the length of your barrel. If you play with a velocity limit the Seagull can actually reach, for example 180, 200, 220, or even 250 feet per second, then I don't think the Harrier actually offers you much benefit over the Seagull. The only thing I can think of is that you could probably use one spring size lower in the Harrier for the same FPS. That'd give you a lighter prime, but with the added length of the longer Harrier, of course. If, however, you want to hit above 250 feet per second, that's where the Harrier's larger air volume gives it the clear edge over the Seagull. With the same barrel and spring combo, the Harrier averages 17 feet per second higher than the Seagull, and with even longer barrels, that gap widens dramatically. The Harrier can average 300 feet per second with the same spring I used in the Seagull, given a long enough barrel. Which one to pick depends entirely on your playstyle and the venue you play at. In a large open park with trees for cover and open clearings, I'd pick the Harrier every time. But for a field with any CQB in it at all, I'd opt for the Seagull. Its shorter length makes it easier to pick corners and maneuver around tight spaces, and it still packs an absolute punch around that 250 FPS range. To end off the video, for a question of the day, which one would you guys pick? Worker Harrier or Worker Seagull? I hope I've given you enough information to help inform your choice, because that's all I have for you today. Consider leaving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to let me know what you thought of the video. Here's 2 other ones you might enjoy, and as always, thank you very much for watching. See ya!